morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So today we're talking about Jonathan Edwards, but of course I have to fill you in on what I left out last week from Samuel Sewall. So Dan had asked about the periwig word, and why is it a periwig and not just wig? And I looked that up and I really couldn't find anything significant about the peri part of that. I think there was the word peruke that was a French word that just means wig, and so it was put onto the English wig. So I didn't see anything that was significant about the peri part of that.
Well, I asked Siri and she didn't know either.
Yeah. Okay, well, if Siri doesn't know, then who would?
That's right.
So also, yes?
Just a quick note, you referred in your last lecture to a position known as the Oyer.
Oyer and Terminer, yes.
Yeah, I noticed when the Supreme Court opened, some guy was up front saying, "Oyez, oyez."
Yeah.
I assume that was him.
Yeah, well, oye just means hear. Hear ye, hear ye. And so oyer is that same word. Yeah. Yeah, kind of an odd thing that still hangs around, huh? So last week I mentioned one of the authors of a biography that I read on Samuel Sewall was related to him, as she was a descendant of his, and that she had inserted into her biography some of the oral history that had been passed down to her that no other biographer that I know of mentions, because it's oral history and nobody really, it's not something that can be proven as something that really happened. But interesting note that may be true or may not, after Samuel Sewall realized how awful and what a miscarriage of justice the witch trials were, according to her family history, he started wearing a hair shirt, a coarse shirt underneath his clothing, as penance for his wrongdoing in convicting people of witchcraft. And supposedly he wore that for the rest of his life and was buried with it. So again, can't be proven, can't be disproven, but that was part of her family oral history. Personally, I kind of doubt that it is true, because that's the kind of thing that a Catholic would do. And the Puritans absolutely abhorred Catholicism as a superstitious religion that had many things that were not at all biblical. So, yeah, to me it just sounds too Catholic for him to want to do something like that. The other thing that I forgot to mention is that near the end of his life, in the last few years, he lived long enough to read himself in the history books. And he read about the Salem witch trials, and he read about his apology in front of the church. And for him, it was a very painful experience for that to be dredged up, and now for it to be in the history books that everybody will know about. Extremely painful. Another cause for him to confess his sins to God and to humble himself in the dust, as Puritans are wont to do. So, moving on to Jonathan Edwards. This is the only likeness that I know of painted in his time. Seems a little bit cartoonish to me. I don't really like this style, but it's all we have. So, and it looks like he's wearing a periwig. Not one of the really gaudy ones, but it certainly looks like a wig nonetheless.
Were the wigs all white looking?
Yes, yes, they were powdered
Right.
white, yeah. So our bibliography, this first one, Patricia J. Tracy, Jonathan Edwards pastor. A very good book, nice and short, 270 pages. That's actually a bit deceptive. If you take out the extensive notes at the back of the book and the index, the content is really a little bit less than 200 pages. So very accessible as far as that goes. So her focus is mostly on his relationship with his congregation. And I kind of like that. Kind of a personal touch, how he related to the youth of his congregation and the authorities, the men who were in charge of various functions in the church. So very nicely done. I enjoyed this work. For anyone who wants a quick read into Jonathan Edwards, this would be the one I'd recommend. This next one, Edwin Scott Gousted, The Great Awakening in New England. This is not specifically about Jonathan Edwards. It is about the phenomenon of the Great Awakening in 1740. A really good overview of that great phenomenon and what he believes caused it, and especially what are the effects of it? What were the extent of it? So a good work as far as that goes, and it gives you a perspective to the fact that Jonathan Edwards was just one among many preachers of that time who were involved in this Great Awakening. The next one, Ola Elizabeth Winslow. If you remember from last week, I had a biography written by her on Samuel Sewall, and I really enjoyed it. This one I especially enjoyed as, and I have the little note there, it won the Pulitzer Prize in biography. So very well written, very personal. What I mentioned last week, that she kind of writes like a novelist, which is very enjoyable for me most of the time. So yes, I truly liked this one. Now this next one, 615 pages, George M. Marsden, Jonathan Edwards. A little more academic, but still very readable for an academic work like this. I enjoyed most of it. One thing that one of my weaknesses as a scholar is I've never been very good at philosophical treatises or writings, and when this author discusses the theology, the extensive theology of Jonathan Edwards, who was one of the great theologians in American history, you kind of lose me there. So, aside from that, it's still a very enjoyable work, if a bit extensive. And then, of course, Jonathan Edwards' basic writings. He's not someone that you read lightly. You can read, and it has some of his works at 11 years old. If I was 11 years old, trying to read his writings at 11 years old, I wouldn't be able to do it. You're just amazed at the precociousness of this kid who can write about science. Well, I'll get into that in just a minute. But anyway, it's truly remarkable. And it also includes several of his sermons that we will get into that are come across kind of academic, and some of them you try to picture the congregation listening to this style of sermons, and you think, wow, these people must be really very academically oriented, even in church, because that's how he presents. So, the early years. Born October 5th, 1703 to Timothy and Esther Edwards. Both of them were highly intelligent. Timothy is a pastor. Esther is the daughter of a pastor. And I didn't put this in, but this is, he's in Connecticut, in the Connecticut Valley along the Connecticut River, kind of northern Connecticut. He's the fifth of 11 children, the only son. Imagine that. You have 10 sisters. Yeah, I can't imagine that. I was in a family, I have 4 brothers, never had a sister. So this is, anyway, as I say, he was extremely precocious as a very young child. And of course, as all youngsters who are intended for the clergy, or at least the university, he learned Latin, Greek, Hebrew, the latest in the sciences. Sir Isaac Newton was the big man of the day in science. He was well versed in Sir Isaac Newton, even at 11 years old. Also in the latest in political theory, John Locke, who was very influential in American history with our revolutionary forefathers. He read John Locke, not just political, but on the theories of the mind, which influenced him greatly. So he wrote essays on light, optics, color, insects, and other such things. I'd like to read to you briefly what he wrote at 11 years old. Get to it. Of the rainbow. This is not the Wizard of Oz type rainbow. We shall endeavor to give a full account of the rainbow, and such a one as we think well understood will be satisfactory to anybody if they are fully satisfied of Sir Isaac Newton's different reflexibility and refrangibility of the rays of light. And if he were not, we refer him to what he has said about it. And we are assured, if he be a person of ordinary logacity and anything versed in such matters, by that time he was thoroughly considered if he'll be satisfied, and after that let him peruse what we are about to say. Yeah, he's 11 years old, okay? It's amazing. So he writes about the rainbow, of colors, of the soul, and of being. Yes?
Was he getting this from tutoring from his parents mainly, you think?
I would think so
He
at this
wouldn't
point.
get it
They
in
may have
school.
hired a tutor for him, but this is definitely something that his parents could tutor him in as well.
His sisters.
Yeah, his sisters will be on him about this. Yeah. Of colors. Colors, we have already supposed that the different refrangibility of rays arises from their different bulk. We have also supposed that they are very elastic bodies. From these suppositions, the colors of natural bodies may be accounted for. That is why some particles of matter reflect such a sort or sorts of rays, and no other, the different density of particles, whence arises a different attraction, and together with their different firmnesses will account for all. Some bodies have so little firmness and so easily give way that they are able to resist the stroke of no rays, but the least and weakest and most reflexible rays, and all other rays that are bigger and therefore their force not so easily resisted, overcome. Okay, I'm done.
Yeah.
I can't even find a period here. So, yeah.
So how did all these writings get saved? I mean, where did they come from?
He
Maybe his
he
parents.
collected his writings together and just
Well,
saved them, I suppose.
Maybe his parents saved them.
Maybe. But I mean, if you had a kid who could write like that, wouldn't you want to say it?
But printers were around at that era and
Yeah.
valued.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, the other thing is that I noticed, in one of the books that I was reading, it saved his earliest letter that he had written to one of his sisters. And I'm not sure how old he was, but around the same age, 10, 11, 12. And the thing that really impressed me was not so much the content of the letter, but that it was legible. If you have ever read or looked at the writings of just about anybody from the 1600s or 1700s, you look at it and you wonder how anyone could decipher it. It's usually a tangled mess that, to me, I look at it and I think, I can't imagine somebody figuring out what was written here. But Jonathan Edwards, when he wrote, and I could clearly see and read very legible writing. Of course, he was only, 11 or 12, and maybe he wrote more legibly because of that. He may have degenerated somewhat as an adult, I don't know. So he entered Yale at the age of 13, which again, I have to emphasize is not that big of a deal. The typical age was 14 or 15. College in those days was more like our high school, only a lot more advanced. But the age-wise, it's kind of a high school age. Of course, he mastered Greek and Roman classics, studied John Locke, Isaac Newton, received his bachelor's, top of his class, of course, 1720, received his MA in 1723, got a few odd jobs here and there, preaching, tutoring, that lasted a few years, trying to figure out where he wanted to go. And finally, he got the plum position with his grandfather. So he accepted a position as associate pastor with Solomon Stoddard, 1726. Stoddard was the great patriarch of Northampton, Massachusetts. Again, still along the Connecticut Valley corridor there. Stoddard had been around for many years, since 1670, and was both a liberalizing influence and a bit of a domineering sort, which is an interesting combination. People liked him because he was the liberalizing sort of person, accepting more people than some Puritan pastors would. But he made sure that he ran the show. He was called the Congregational Pope. This was not a compliment. But this was from Boston. Some of the clergy in Boston saw him as a bit domineering and didn't like that. But he was popular in his own parish. There's Solomon Stoddard. And for those of you who, like myself, do not always know place names and where things are, here's Northampton. The Connecticut Valley, Connecticut River runs north and south here. And Jonathan Edwards was from a small town just on the Connecticut side. So the distance from Northampton to Boston directly would be about 100 miles, but nobody traveled overland, or very few would. You travel up and down the Connecticut River and get to Boston by boat, generally speaking, until the roads improved significantly. So Edwards becomes a family man after he gets his plum job, married Sarah Pierpont, who was 17, daughter of the minister who also performed the ceremony. They had 11 children, and shockingly, they all grew up to adulthood. Very unusual. And she was a very pious, known to be a very pious young woman. And some of the comments of Edwards about her, beloved of that great being caring for little except to meditate on him. Sometimes lost all ability to stand or speak. She was in such raptures with regard to her faith in God and Jesus. He actually wrote one of the treaties later on that I'll mention. He wrote about her as an example of a true religious feeling that people would have. Sarah Pierpont Edwards. So not long after he got his plum job, Solomon Stoddard passed away, February 1729, and Edwards had to fill some very large shoes. It's not easy. He's still in his 20s, a young man, and filling the place of this great patriarch was not an easy chore. He also sensed at this time, once Solomon Stoddard passed away, this dullness of religion in the congregation. Something happened that affected the people when Solomon Stoddard was gone. They seemed to lose some of their religious affections. And it was a trial. He worked very hard to gain the respect of his congregation. And he actually broke down in the summer after Solomon Stoddard passed away and was out of, and could not preach or serve his congregation for a number of weeks before he recovered. One difference that he had with Solomon Stoddard, difference in emphasis rather than opinions, he was going to focus more on the youth. He noticed that the youth had some practices, had some behaviors that were not conducive to true religion, and he was going to work on that. He had a real heart for them. Now, I'm going to take a little bit of a side trip here just to fill you in on some of the practices of the day. Most ministers, if you were not in the big city in a large church, you lived in poverty. It was not pleasant in many respects. So money in and of itself was fairly scarce. Specie that was used as money was not always in good supply. And so the pastor was often paid in food. Your congregation was mostly farmers. If they didn't have money, they would give you food, bushels of corn, or whatever else that they were growing. So things like tobacco. If there's a local tobacco farmer, you'd be paid in tobacco, and you could use that as currency. Wampum, as I mentioned before, was a currency used by the Native Americans, and English as well, so you might be paid in wampum. Sometimes even lead bullets would be your pay. Firewood, a very important part of life in wintertime, would also be considered part of your pay. And sometimes just manual labor. A poor farmer didn't have anything to give you, so he would supply some labor for you, do some work around your house or your farm. Parishioners, in theory, could be fined if they did not supply some sort of payment for you. Not often enforced, but in theory, that is something that could happen. And sometimes the fact that you are supposed to be paid X amount in money or food or labor doesn't mean that you're going to get it. You may see on paper that your annual salary is this. It was very difficult collecting for some ministers. One of the greatest problems between the congregation and ministers was the minister's pay. Another aspect that I have not talked about and delved into much, as I said earlier, I'm not much of a theologian. This is a topic that I get into on only a very shallow level. And so it's not something I've talked a lot about, but today I have to. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the theology of the Calvinists. Total depravity, one of the key points in Calvinist doctrine. The human condition is such that you are so depraved, you are completely, utterly unable to even ask for forgiveness in faith. The faith that you have, if at all, is going to be given to you by God. And God, as we know, the Calvinist belief, God chooses those whom he chooses and rejects everyone else. And that's just the way it is. So if that's the way God works, this was a very difficult thing that was wrestled with by many of that day. If God determines who he's going to save and those he's going to damn well ahead of time, why is it that we're doing anything? Why don't we just wait for him to act? Well, that's not the way it works. God has commanded us, and so we must follow his commands. He will use the preacher to throw out the seeds, as it were, as the biblical parable indicates. He throws out the seeds, and God will use those seeds or not as he chooses to inspire faith in the hearers. Now, in each congregation, there was an issue so there were basically two types of members. If you were baptized as a child and you were raised in the church, if you're in England, in the Anglican Church, you are assumed from infancy, you are baptized, you are a member of the church. And that's just the way it is. You are from birth or from baptism, you attend church, you are a member of the church. And unless you do something scandalous, unless you are a notorious sinner, you are a full member of the church. In America, when they came over, we have the Puritans who wanted to purify the religion. They recognized that infant baptism is not an intelligent conversion. One must receive the Spirit at some point intelligently. You must have faith in God, and at some point, God saves you through faith. Now, the problem is that a lot of people were kind of afraid to come forward and say, yes, I have had this conversion experience. In our day, it seems a very simple thing. You just say, yes, I believe in Christ, has died for my sins, and I have asked him in faith to save me, and therefore I am saved. It was not so simple with the Calvinist. The Calvinist did not want to know that you have accepted Christ. The Calvinist wanted to know, has Christ accepted you? Big difference. And so when you have this, when you go before the pastor and you say, yes, I am a believer, he's going to ask you, okay, so tell me about that. Don't tell me that you have asked Christ into your life and you have put your faith in him. Tell me what he has done to you. What is your experience? And that was a very difficult thing for many people because they did not, generally speaking, want to just make something up. And so, so that was a difficulty. And so you have basically two types of members. The members who have been baptized and have not yet had that conversion experience, and those who have had that conversion experience. So there is some tension there. And so, as the generations passed in Puritan New England, there was a problem. More and more people were growing up without that conversion experience. They had been baptized as infants, but they had not experienced what the true believer was supposed to. And so the problem is when you grow up and you're in the church and you have children and you're not a full member, you were not supposed to have your children baptized because you're not a full member. So in 1662, they came up with the halfway covenant, which was a compromise. If you have been baptized as an infant and you grow up in the church and you do not have a scandalous lifestyle, then yes, we will allow you to baptize your children and we will allow you to have communion. This was a great compromise that some people were good with and some people were not. Interestingly enough, the pastors, the ministers of New England were more in favor of it than many of the parishioners. The parishioners who had this conversion experience and were full members were very jealous of their membership and valued it highly and thought this cheapened church membership. The other great decline in religion was the growth of the belief in Arminianism, which is basically, it's not the Calvinist doctrine that I was just mentioning, that you have to not just reach out to God, but you have to know that God has reached out to you. The Arminian belief is that you can, of your own will, have the faith to believe in God, ask for forgiveness, and be saved on account of that. This was anathema to the ministers of New England. Surely we should all know that God chooses whom he will choose and will reject whom he will reject. It is God, and God alone, who gives people the faith or not to believe. So, Jonathan Edwards, as a good Calvinist, chose not to attack Arminianism as many ministers were doing. He chose just to give sermons that emphasized that God was all-powerful and that people were totally depraved. So in his sermon, God glorified in the work of redemption. The emphasis was entirely that God gives you the faith to believe, that man is utterly depraved. You do not have any ability to reach out to God. You are too evil and sinful for that. And that seemed to work for his congregation. Then, as he built upon this, he eventually started becoming, shall we say, a bit more dark in his sermons. In 1735, there was a great revival. This was not quite the Great Awakening that we'll talk about in a little bit, but it was certainly the biggest revival that the Connecticut Valley had experienced. Revivals were not a new thing. Revivals would come and go in various communities and could be very impressive. This one in 1735 was the greatest of them to date. And he preached the justice of God in the damnation of sinners. How'd you like to sit through a sermon like that? But the topic was basically the types of sins that the congregation would know about, that we're familiar with, that participated in. Such horrendous sins as not keeping the Sabbath holy. The youth groups, the youth of the church, they would go out frolicking. They would hang out together. And we all know what happens when the youth get together at night after church to go have fun. Nothing good can come from that. So these are the things that he spoke out against. And that seemed to impress people tremendously. He was a big proponent of the authority of the father and the mother to influence their children. The children should be should be subject to the authority of their parents. And he would speak to the parents and tell them they need to have rein in their children, to teach them, to give them religious instruction on Sunday. Sunday was not just a day of rest, a day that you go to church and come home and relax. It was a day of worship, the whole day. And by the way, the Sabbath, just like the Jewish Sabbath, starts at sundown, Saturday night, and it goes through sundown Sunday evening. And during that time, this was not just rest and relaxation. You were to get together with your family after or before church and spend that time in learning about the Bible, praying together, singing psalms, encouraging one another in your faith. And that was something that had been sadly neglected. So here's a very common painting of Jonathan Edwards giving his sermon. It is not a very good painting for a couple of reasons. For one, he looks like he's cross-eyed. The other is his style of preaching was not demonstrative. He was calm. He was unemotional for the most part. He did not give great hand gestures, but he had an intensity that people felt and truly could be moving in that way. So here's his style. He spoke in a low, deliberate tone. It was easy, natural, and very solemn. He did not make wild emotional gestures, but it was the inner fire, you might say, that could be sensed in his tone. And the sermon topics in what he was preaching about had an immediacy that could make people feel that God's wrath could drop at any moment. This was not something that you could just go home and think about. Your death could be at any time. God's wrath could be poured out in this meeting itself. You never know. So there was no time to waste to think about. You are the sinner who needs to repent now. So, at this point throughout the spring of 1735 and into the summer, revival spread. People would write about this. Jonathan Edwards himself would write tracts, and they would be spread far and wide. And throughout the Connecticut Valley, people would come to listen to him, and he would travel to various other churches who would invite him, and the revival would spread. And the writings that people would read would be greatly, would inspire them. And there would be copycats who would follow his style of preaching and his types of illustrations that he would preach about. And so, as I said, a revival spread throughout the valley. And his church attendance doubled from 300 to 600. A lot of the people who were most influenced, apparently, were the youth that Edwards was most concerned about. And so all of these frolics seemed to end. And the youth themselves, not so much from their parents, but from Jonathan Edwards, would take and get together in their youth groups and pray and study the Bible and sing psalms. All of the things that Jonathan Edwards really wanted them to do, they were doing, even apart from what their parents were instructing them to do. So it was a marvelous thing for Jonathan Edwards. Now, some people who criticized this said it was just kind of a frantic frenzy of hyped up people in hysterics, because some people did get into hysterics. The fear that he invoked, that he would inspire, sometimes sent shrieks through the congregation. So he wrote about this, a faithful narrative of the surprising work of God. An interesting work. I had assumed before I read that he would talk about his sermons and how they influence people, but it really wasn't about that. He talks about encouraging the community and the youth groups to use their gatherings for religious purposes, and that's what happened. He didn't talk so much about the hysterics that occasionally happened as well, but the great influence that people were now very concerned and loved to read the Bible, to sing psalms together, to pray together. All the things that we wanted them to do, they are now doing. But it could not last. In June of 1735, Jonathan Edwards' uncle cut his own throat and died. He was in such despair because he could see all around him people reaching out, people being saved, people loving God, and he could not experience that for himself. Now, it was said that he had something of a melancholy disposition before this. This was not something that was new to him. But the fact that he could see so many people being saved and could not feel that experience himself sent him into despair. And so he cut his own throat and died. And that was kind of, it was something that many other people noted, and other people who have that same melancholy disposition felt the same way. And suicides seemed to go rampant throughout the Connecticut Valley along with the revival. We don't know how many people killed themselves, but it seemed to be a significant number. Jonathan Edwards mentions it himself in his writings, that he was astounded that so many people are now committing suicide. And so his comment, among many others, was that God seems to be withdrawing from us. And after the excitement of this spring and summer of 1735, Jonathan Edwards again breaks down and needs to spend several weeks apart from his congregation. So that was one of the aspects that signaled the end of the revival. Another, the good news, now that we have so many people attending church, we have to build a new church. And so they did. Took a couple of years, and they built one significantly larger. The bad news is that now, in New England, people have largely, a lot of people are assigned seats. You have box pews that are assigned to most people according to your degree in society. Now, imagine the committee that is to assign people their pews. How would you like to do that? and be the one that people will say, why is it that I get that pew when I should have a higher level of pew? You would not be a very popular person. Jonathan Edwards probably happily did not sit on that committee. So he was not responsible for assigning people their positions. But just when you think that people are loving God, humbly serving each other, now something like this comes up, and everybody becomes petty and jealous and angry that they are not given the position that they think they deserve. So there are, I have this note at the bottom, they are seated according to their station. For instance, if you are the governor, or I should say the mayor, or the leader politically in town, you have the highest position. If you are a wealthy merchant or farmer, that's another consideration. The third one would be your usefulness in society. And who's going to judge that? But it is judged, and you are given your pew accordingly. So, here are the seating arrangements according to Roman numerals. If you are a Roman numeral 1, you get the best seats. It goes all the way down to Roman numeral 20. How'd you like to be a number 20? Of course, in the center you have the open seating for people who have not been designated at all. And as you can tell, the men and women are separate. If you are in the boxed seats, this was kind of a controversy too. Should men and women sit together? The Bible clearly states in some places that the men and women should be separate. Well, in some cases they are, in some cases they're not. So as I mentioned, I think a couple weeks back, the widows have their own sections. So if you're a widow, you can sit here or here or here. By the way, I made this myself. I tried to get this copied onto the slides from one of my books. It was on one of the pages. I was not successful at that, so I made this myself. It is not an exact replica, but it gives you the idea of how it was set up. And by the way, this is a two-story building. So some of these may be at the balcony as well. So, yes?
Whose wife? Would that be the
Yes,
minister's
this
wife?
is, so here's the pulpit.
Yeah.
This is Jonathan Edwards' wife.
His wife.
This is where he and the family sits. So, yeah, some of this doesn't really make much sense to me. I'm just copying this on here. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and so on. But you have 2 back here. This may be the balcony, I'm not sure. The stairs would be on either side here. But this is just to kind of give you an idea. Each of these boxed seats are assigned. And by the way, if you have a particular box seat, you are to pay a certain amount as well for that. If you have a higher level, you pay more. That's just the way it works.
So widows were valued over other classes of people?
Yes, they were.
Well, that's
But you know,
very nice.
the widows themselves have different levels as well. So just keep that in mind too. But sure, widows have a special value above other people.
And those were inherited, weren't they? And they went by, somebody passed on and went to your family members, right? Those
Yes, yes and no, because this could be revised. I mean, if you were a person of scandalous character in a good family, well, you're gonna be demoted. But yeah, generally speaking, if you are in this family and you grow up, as long as you're not scandalous in some way, you will keep that seating. Then again, if you are the son or daughter of a political person, the mayor of the town or the assistants or someone who's important, and you grow up and you are no longer, and you have your own family now, you're going to be given a different seating arrangement. But it'll probably be preferential because of your family. So I put this up here just as an example of one of the other petty things that are going on in the latter part of the 1730s that indicate the decline of religion in Northampton and the Connecticut Valley. And further, God's displeasure demonstrated. The diphtheria epidemic started to hit 1735 and lasted throughout the rest of that decade. It's a terrible infection of the throat. Diphtheria is something that I only think of it as something that I was inoculated against as a child. Other than that, most people have very little knowledge of it because it just almost doesn't exist anymore. But it could ravage a society. Many people, and only a few thousand people in any given area. When 1,000 people dies, it's a big deal. Sometimes, and this was affected mostly children, and so you were terribly afraid it could wipe out every one of your children. And it did on a number of occasions. Such and such a family has 7 kids. They all die from diphtheria, a terrible disease that infects the throat and basically kills off the tissue so that you can no longer breathe and could bring death within 3 days. But at the end of that, we have the Great Awakening. And this was not brought about, or Jonathan Edwards was not the main character in this next awakening. It was an outside source. George Whitefield, who was an itinerant preacher in England, a great Calvinist preacher who made a big splash in England, was invited to come out to America to preach up and down the coast. Many pastors had invited him, Jonathan Edwards being one. And so he came to America, and he took America by storm. Arrived in 1740, traveled throughout the colonies. You might say he was kind of like the Billy Graham of his day. These big, great revivals. Sometimes, very often, the churches were not large enough to hold the crowd. And so he would preach out in the open air to thousands and thousands of people. And he was different. We have a long tradition in our country of revivalist preachers. Billy Graham, of course, everybody's familiar with, a great charismatic preacher. But we have many others. Some of you may have heard of Billy Sunday in the early 1900s, a great charismatic preacher, and many others. George Whitefield was the first. As I mentioned, Jonathan Edwards was very calm in his delivery. No wild emotions, no great hand gestures. Nobody did. All of the preachers, these Calvinist, conservative preachers, were pretty much the same in that regard. George Whitefield was the first. He put on a show. He could preach. He waved his arms. He would sing. He would laugh. He would cry. But it was a show. And that's what really got people. It was entertainment along with preaching. Now, if someone were to examine his sermons, there's really nothing much special about them. If you look at Jonathan Edwards' sermons, you can see Jonathan Edwards has an effective style. What he is preaching is important. you could see how it could affect people. George Whitfield's sermons were really nothing special, standard fare, but it was his performance that really got people, and people were thronging to see him. So here's a quote here. It was a very frequent thing to see a house full of outcries, faintings, convulsions, and such like. He was the first great charismatic leader. You think of the charismatic churches that can be very loud, and people might cry out or dance in the aisles or that sort of thing. George Whitfield was the first to have that kind of a reaction from his crowd.
Was there speaking in tongues? Like,
Not that I know of. Nothing that I read had that as part of the service. But everything but that. So the awakening lasted about 2 years with various parts of New England and up and down the coast, I should say, having these revivals. Now, George Whitfield, of course, and this is him preaching out in the open air, was the great preacher of the time. Many others started taking hints from him and copied him, and that style of preaching caught on. People loved it. Well, some people loved it. The old guard did not like it much at all. They thought it was just a bunch of hysterics. And so there was a pushback, but at first it was a very weak pushback.
You're saying Whitfield, it looks like Whitefield.
It does, doesn't it? It is pronounced Whitfield, though.
Any idea who the guy with the tankard is?
Yeah, I know. Look at that.
A sinner.
I don't know who painted this picture, but this seems kind of out of place.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's have a beer. Yeah.
yeah.
You'd expect that this would include more people fainting or screaming out in the crowd, but
He's saying, I'll drink to that.
yeah, sure. And so Jonathan Edwards had invited George Whitfield out to preach, and George Whitfield traveled up the coast, preaching at many churches along the way, stopped in Boston, spent 10 days in Boston and the surrounding area, and then came out to visit yes?
Question, you mentioned the difficulty of ministers getting paid.
Yes.
How were the financial arrangements for Whitfield? Did he keep the money that they got at the door, or did he share it with the local ministers?
Well, there's a lot more to that. Let me explain that George Whitfield, one of his causes was not just the gospel. He was raising money for an orphanage that he was sponsoring. And so one of the appeals when he was preaching out to his crowd was for the poor orphans of this orphanage that I'm raising money for. And so how money is distributed exactly, I'm not sure. But certainly the hat was passed, or the collection plate, and none other than Benjamin Franklin, who heard about George Whitfield and was so impressed by what he heard, but was skeptical. He's not going to get to me. I'm going to listen to this guy, and I know he's raising money, but I'm not going to give any money for this. And so he sits in the crowd, and he's listening to George Whitfield with his appeal to the poor orphans. And sure enough, Benjamin Franklin, okay, I'll put in a little bit of money towards this cause. And he sits a little longer. Okay, I'll give a little bit more, because surely it's a deserving cause. And by the end of the sermon, Benjamin Franklin gave up all the money he had on him for this cause. He was so taken in by this preaching style. So he had a cause that he was raising money for, How much money he got, I don't know. But people were very willing to dish out money for when they're listening to George Whitefield.
And the orphanage was back in England?
No, it was actually in America.
Oh.
Yeah. There was an orphanage, even in England, before he even came out. He had this cause for this orphanage. So
They could trace that he was actually giving money to the orphanage.
yeah, I don't know how that was. One of the things about George Whitefield, he had this great talent as a preacher. He had almost no other talents. He was not an organization man. He was not someone who could lead an orphanage and organize that and make it come together in an organized fashion. I'm not sure how that all worked out, but I know he was a complete failure in virtually everything else he did in life towards organizing businesses or charities or whatever else he did. Anyway, coming back to Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards was very impressed. George Whitefield came out, stayed with him for a few days, Friday through Monday, and preached several times, and just loved him. And I must say also, George Whitefield was duly impressed, not just with Jonathan Edwards, but with his family. He thought, this is a wonderful family that Jonathan Edwards has. I love his wife, she's so pious, and myself, being a single man, makes me all the more earnest in wanting God to provide for me the type of wife that Jonathan Edwards has. She's a wonderful woman. So anyway, after George Whitefield passes by, Jonathan Edwards comes up with his most famous sermon, the most famous sermon in American history. And again, my first introduction to Jonathan Edwards and his sermon was not in a history class, it was in my English class, like the others that I had mentioned. I read this sermon in an English class, and I thought it was interesting. I mean, from my perspective, 300 years later, it's not something that is in any way offensive to me. But there was a girl in class who was very offended at this sermon and somewhat put out by the idea that a preacher would preach such things. And she was a Christian herself who attended church regularly. But anyway, just some memories. So the great sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Isn't that a great title? I mean, if you really want to impress your parishioners on this topic, this is a great title. And the genius of this sermon is not that he's just preaching about hellfire and damnation and the sufferings of the damned. This is the tension of someone being held above the fires by God himself, and that at any moment, as you are sitting in your seats, you could drop, and there's nothing to hold you back. There's nothing that you have that can save you other than God himself and his mere pleasure. That's the kind of tension he builds throughout the sermon. God is extremely angry with you for all of your grievous sins, and there's nothing in you worthy enough for him to, and there's no reason for him to hold back in his wrath. He could drop you and be perfectly justified in doing so. And it's recorded that he had to stop once or twice in his sermon because of the shrieks and cries of his congregation. He had to wait for the noise to die down before he could continue. So hold on to your seats. And by the way, I don't want any screams or cries out here. So Just, yeah, no fainting in the aisles.
But you will be fully convinced of it. Those that are gone from being in the like circumstances with you see that it was so with them. For destruction came suddenly upon most of them when they expected nothing of it, and while they were saying peace and
How's
safety,
that?
now they see that those things that they depended on for peace and safety were nothing but thin air and empty shadows. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider, or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors your sins and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He is of purer eyes than to bear to have you in his sight. You are 10,000 times so abominable in his eyes as the most hateful, venomous serpent is in ours. You have offended him by your continual rejection of his Son, infinitely more than ever a stubborn rebel did his prince, and yet 'tis nothing but his hand that holds you from falling into the fire at every moment. 'Tis to be ascribed to nothing else that you did not go down to hell the last night, that you was suffered and allowed to awake again in this world after you closed your eyes to sleep. And there is no other reason to be given why you have not dropped into hell since you arose this morning, but that God's hand has held you up. There is no other reason to be given why you have not gone down to hell since you have sat here in the house of God, provoking his pure eyes by your sinful, wicked manner of attending his solemn and joyous worship. Yea, there is nothing else that is to be given as a reason why you don't this very moment drop down into hell. Oh, sinner, consider the fearful danger you are in. 'Tis a great furnace of wrath, a wide and bottomless pit, full of the fire of wrath that you are held over in the hand of that God, whose wrath is provoked and incensed as much against you as against many of the damned in hell. You hang by a slender thread, with the flames of divine wrath flashing about it, and ready every moment to singe it and burn it asunder, and you have no interest in any mediator, and nothing to lay hold of to save yourself. Nothing to keep off the flames of wrath, nothing of your own, nothing that you ever have done, nothing that you ever can do to induce God to spare you one moment. And consider here more particularly, for a few moments longer, several things concern.
How's that?
Listen to that every week, I'd go home and kill myself.
Yeah. So now you understand why that one guy cut his own throat, huh? Yeah.
The original fire and brimstone.
Yeah. Yeah, quite a work. But at the time, it was incredibly effective. And when
He changed style in a way.
he did,
It was so, even-handed and,
well, I don't know the guy who is actually preaching this. Of course, that's not Jonathan Edwards himself. But
that is a different style.
yeah, I knew there would be somebody on YouTube who had this, preached out sermon, and there's actually quite a few. And I listened to the voices of a number of them. Most of them I didn't care for at all because they're too feeble in their voice, too timid or meek sounding coming across. And I thought, I really wish that you'd have some Darth Vader voice who could preach that sermon, and that would be truly impressive. But this was the best that I could find.
But if you read that as a teenager,
Yeah.
I did, and you have an imagination.
Oh, yeah.
Which I truly believe we had greater imaginations then than kids
Sure.
do now.
Yeah.
That gets to you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That can be truly impressive on a young mind. So, anyway, the effects of this great awakening that shook the entire New England colonies, many communities were divided. The old lights and the new lights. Lots of new churches started up because of the church. Many churches were splitting. Jonathan Edwards kept his church together. He was kind of the middleman between the two extremes, and he kept his church together because of that. But as I said, many churches split. Many people openly challenging their religious leaders, which was kind of a new thing. You were supposed to have great respect for your pastor, your ministers, especially with regard to religious ideas. And when the people started saying, no, pastor, you are old, you're stuck in your old ways, and we have these new preachers out here who really know how to preach the Word of God. And so we are leaving you. And that happened over and over again. And this, many historians think of the Great Awakening as a precursor to our own revolution against Great Britain. The democratic forces that were born at this time, people speaking out against their authorities, saying, I know better than you how to do this. Very democratic, very revolutionary.
You know if the churches had local autonomy?
Yes, and one of the things that I hadn't mentioned, one of the myriad of things that I haven't mentioned, the difference between the churches, Church of England practices, and the Church of England still, because we were not separatists, right? They were Puritans trying to purify the church. So there's a difference between how it was practiced in England and in America. In England, you have Presbyterian style, and thus the Presbyterian church today. In America, you have the congregational style, and thus you have the congregational churches. Congregational churches are named because each congregation was autonomous. You could have a synod of elders of the church, and they could make decisions. They could not impose those decisions on the individual churches. They could encourage them and advise them, but you do not have the hierarchy of the presbytery as in the Presbyterian church, where we are the authority and we will tell all of the churches what they are to practice and believe. So yes, thank you for bringing that up.
Is this Great Awakening linked to that specific sermon and the style of it, or was it just coincidentally happening?
It was sparked, of course, by George Whitefield. The ground was very fertile, let's say, for that to happen. He was the spark, and a very great one, that set this whole thing ablaze. As I said, many ministers knew that something needed to happen. We need someone from the outside to come in and stir people up. And even Jonathan Edwards found that he was more effective as a revivalist preacher in other churches than his own because they were so used to him. So, and this would happen, there are many other preachers out there. There were a couple of brothers, the Tennant brothers, who were preaching even more hellfire and damnation sermons than Jonathan Edwards. That was their specialty, is to preach in such a frightful way that people were just so scared of hell that they were trying to reach out to God to save them. So Edwards writes a few tracts defending the Great Awakening, the distinguishing marks of a work of the Spirit of God, something that he noticed and that a lot of people accused the people who were coming forward and saying that they are now believers in this hysterical manner. How do we know that they're true? How do we know that they're not just faking it? How do we know that it's just not an emotional upheaval, that these people are just become hysterical and then say that, yes, I believe now. God has touched my soul and I'm a believer. Because as time went on, the fruits were not there for some people. And so it was something that Jonathan Edwards had to deal with too. The person who seemed so on fire for God one moment, as the weeks, months, and years passed, did not always stick with their faith from the beginning. So anyway, so he wrote about this, and some thoughts concerning the present revival of religion in New England, and a treatise concerning religious affections. This last one, he wrote about his wife, and how a true Christian would feel when the Spirit of God touches them. And this is my example, my beloved wife. And then Edwards was fired after his great triumph, because Edwards wanted to go back. Another thing that I hadn't delved into too much, but I mentioned, as time went on past this revival, he started losing the respect of his congregation, often for just petty things. The seating arrangements, somebody wants a particular favor, my daughter's marriage I want annulled because of this or that reason. And so arguments start cropping up in the congregation, and Edwards has to deal with them. But the break really came when Edwards says, now that we are so fervently Christian in our population as a congregation, we're going to go back to the time before the halfway covenant. You must have your conversion experience in addition to being baptized as an infant to be a full member. And nobody liked that, or almost nobody liked that. And it's kind of a curious thing. I wish I could get into the mind of the congregation when he announced this, because universally, people just despised that idea. They really felt that since I have been baptized as an infant, and I have lived my life righteously as I grew up, and I believe what I'm supposed to believe, I should therefore be a member of this church. And one guy in particular, when he came to Edwards for membership, and Edwards says, okay, tell me about your conversion experience. The man says, you know, I've had a conversion experience, but I don't want to tell you about it. I shouldn't have to. It is my right to, since I'm a baptized person, and I lived a righteous life, and I believe what I'm supposed to believe, I shouldn't have to do anything else. And he was offended at that, as were most of the congregation. But Jonathan Edwards insisted, and he knew it was a losing cause. But he pushed through with it anyway, and they fired him.
At what age was he at that time?
So this was, he was like in his late 40s, mid to late 40s. So yeah, only 19 out of the 600 voted in his favor. So he moved on. He became a missionary to the Indians. He was given a position out at Stockbridge, Massachusetts, out in the western wilderness of Massachusetts, in Stockbridge. And he spent the next 7 years developing as a theologian. He wrote extensively on the Arminian heresies and why they are wrong and other things. Didn't accomplish much with the Indians or with the small population of white people who were in that village, but did do a lot of writing, for which he is now famous among theologians. And then his tragic death. He got a position. He was going to be the president of Princeton, a very prestigious position. So he traveled to Princeton. There was a smallpox epidemic going on. And being a man of science, he and his family were inoculated. Most of the time, those inoculations are safe. Every once in a while, they're not. And in his case, it was not. And after a few weeks, it developed the smallpox. It went into his throat and killed him in that manner. So, and then his wife, just a few months later, died of dysentery. So both of them passed away at fairly young ages. They still had a couple of kids at home, young kids under the age of 10, who had to be taken care of by relatives. And he has monuments. So this one is in Stockbridge, where he was the missionary to the Indians. This is his tomb, and this is, okay, I had something here. Where was it? Oh, there it is. Cenotaph. Has anyone ever heard of that word? I've never heard of that. So a cenotaph is the monument, like a gravestone, where you are not buried. It's a monument for a person who probably lived in the area but now is buried somewhere else. So that's his cenotaph there in Northampton. Okay, any questions?
Yeah, I'm speculating about, like, early in his life, he was so interested in science and he knew so much, nature and so
Yeah.
forth. And then, was it his pious, ultra pious wife?
It was not his wife, it was his upbringing. His father was a pastor. I mean, I'm sure he had a number of relatives who were in the ministry. And so that's where he went. One might conjecture with his great mind if he would have pursued the law and lived longer, it's very conceivable he could have been one of our founding fathers of the Revolution.
Yeah.
He was about the same age as Benjamin Franklin.
Oh.
So, yeah, not inconceivable. Anything else?
You mentioned
Arminianism, yes.
What was Arminianism?
Arminianism. Arminianism, it came from a guy named Arminius many years before, but it's basically the free will of man to be able to do good works on our own, to reach out to God, to put our faith in God on our own without God's help. I mean, God, the passage that they would look to is that all who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved, right? So that's an Arminian passage that basically for them means that everybody has the capacity within themselves to reach out to God and to be saved by our own means by asking. The Calvinists would say no, total depravity. You are unable to do anything, even to reach out to God. You have, for people who have faith, it's because God gave them that faith.
I found that curious because they're famous Roman.
Arminius? Yeah. Yes?
It seems the thrust of his sermons, there's an apocalyptic pessimism. And it seems that his congregation converted to Arminianism in that vote. I mean, they took it upon themselves to say, we've had enough.
Right. They wouldn't have said that. They were still good Calvinists. But when it comes to running the show in church, we should be able to be members without having to tell you about our conversion experience. But Arminianism was gaining ground gradually throughout New England. Yes?
Do you know of any tracts or sermons that were written pointing out how damaging this Calvinism, how neurotic it was making children? And
that has certainly been written about. Yeah. And even Edwards wrote about some of the suicides and very concerned about it and trying to let people know not to despair because you look to God and you may be one of the elect. I don't know how he worded it, but yes, he did speak about that. But yeah, that's more of a modern thing
Yeah.
for people, and I'm sure lots of psychologists and others have written about the dangers of such an extreme type of preaching. Yes?
What did he do that was so noteworthy that he became one of the really famous people from it? Sinners and
You mean after all of this? Okay, well, one thing, as I had mentioned, he is considered by many to be the greatest mind of the colonial era prior to the Revolutionary era. Greater than Cotton Mather, who was had a great mind himself, but Cotton Mather was not an original thinker. Jonathan Edwards, who was one of the leaders of the Great Awakening, which really made his name, he was also a great theologian and had great influence in the Calvinistic doctrines of the day. So, anything else? Yes?
He was originally a Puritan and then changed to Calvinist.
Puritans were Calvinists.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was it.
Thank you.
Where would you put George Whitefield in the Calvinist Arminian?
He was definitely a Calvinist, but he was not a deep thinker by any means. He was a showman. He knew how to work the crowd. That's what he was. But he was, he would say that he's definitely in the Calvinist Puritan tradition.
Well, he came over to the U.S. with John Wesley. There's
Right,
a
yeah.
famous ship.
Who
that
was-
came to Savannah.
yeah.
And that orphanage, by the way, is in Savannah.
Right, yeah, in
that he's
Georgia.
working for.
Yeah,
It's interesting between him and Wesley what their,
right,
how that
yeah.
contact.
Wesley and the Methodist, who became, started the Methodist Church, was in the Armenian camp.
Yeah.
And they were good friends. They were both Methodists, but this was before their doctrines had been fleshed out, shall we say. Okay, next week, James Oglethorpe, the founder of Georgia.
If not before.
Thank you.